Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. Looks like YouTube has changed their live studio around, so I don't know where I am anymore, but hopefully I'm streaming. Maybe I'll head to my front page of my channel. It says I'm streaming. If you can hear me, drop something in chat. But yeah, we'll just have to hope. This may be a short one anyway, because California's on fire. It seems I'm not only in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic state, in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic country, but I'm now also in the middle of a firestorm. My current location is not in immediate jeopardy, but it's not too far from it, so it's conceivable that in the next hour some sort of alarm will go off outside and I'll need to run. But probably not. I'll just keep streaming and hoping. But I have other things that I'm gonna have to do around this fire situation, so it's probably gonna be a short stream today. So let's get to it. So, starting with the countries, I think it's been a week, maybe more than a week since my last live stream. I've been slowing these down a little bit because not a lot of stuff seems to change from day to day, but a week is a long time, so we may see a significant change week over week. If we look at the severity graph, and again, severity is my own metric that combines daily cases per million, roughly the daily cases, but adjusted for population by million, with the combining that with the growth rate, so that things are more severe if they have more cases relative to their population, but also are more severe if they have a higher growth rate. We can see here the countries, the top 25 countries in severity. There's an uptick of some sort, at least at the bottom end of this. There's a few of these countries that weren't so hard hit now are. Let's zoom in a little bit. Severity of 100 is where we start to pay attention, start to say, yeah, there's really something going on there. It's a warm spot. And we can see Namibia and Paraguay, which weren't on the radar at all, have risen to there. And we can see a few other countries that are also rising. Costa Rica, Kuwait, and who's that? Trinidad and Tobago. So these are not huge population countries. These are smaller countries that are catching the wave late. But in order to make it this far up in severity, they have to have a pretty high number of cases relative to their population, and they have to have a fairly high growth rate. When we look at this list of top most severe countries, we can see that there are some significant countries, some large countries there. For instance, the United States is there. And some, interestingly, Spain is back there. Spain is showing up again as a severity hotspot, though not really hot. There's almost no one over, well, I wouldn't say almost no one, but there are only six countries in the world that have a severity over 200, which I'd call a hotspot. Peru, Bahrain, rising again, Panama, Brazil, Argentina. There you can see the Central South America cluster showing up again, as it always does in recent months. Central South America, including the United States, still the major source of new COVID cases. So these are all pretty bad. On the bright side, most of them seem to be steady at their current level. Really only Bahrain rising. Bahrain, which was there up with Qatar for the longest time as a really, really serious hotspot, has dropped a lot in recent months, recent weeks, really. But again, it's back. It's not really. It does not seem to have gotten over it. It was up at 400. I believe if we went back even further into May and April, we'd see that it was up to 800 or 1,000 or really, really high severity. Maybe I should have this graph go farther back than just 60 days, which I think is what it's, oh wait, no, this is just because I zoomed in. There's Bahrain. Yeah, but the graph does go back to March. And we can see Bahrain, along with Qatar, was the worst. And then it got quite a lot better, dropping into warm spot territory, but now it's back a little bit. Bahrain is not over this yet. Overall, however, there aren't any really, really hard-hit countries right now. As we can see, it's possible to be at 1,000. You can be Spain back in the day, for instance, or you can be Qatar back in the day, or you can be Bahrain, or even, well, Panama, I guess, is still kind of there. So we have a number of warm and hot countries. There's no sense here, to my eye, that they're taking off, that they're getting a lot worse, but there's definitely not a sense that these 20 are getting better either. It seems like the world is kind of holding steady, at least at the top. If we look down, I don't have this graph. I'm going to reload my page and see if I can get the graph by all countries, and then we can look at growth rates and see, once we adjust for growth rates, we often see slightly better numbers, indicating that many countries are heading into a better place. All right, this isn't reloading for me. My ping's looking fine. It looks like my streaming is working fine. But this page isn't loading. That's interesting. Well, let's just pop over to the States for a minute while that loads. Or did it just finish? Yeah, I think it did. Okay, good. There are all the countries. Severity for all countries. Similarly, no extraordinarily bad countries. The ones that we already saw are the top 20, so that's all the top ones here. There are a whole lot of other countries, but they're mostly not very severely hit. But let's look at my second favorite graph these days, which is the growth graph. In particular, the growth graph for the countries that are hardest hit. Those countries that have the most cases adjusted for population, what are they doing now? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, but I'd say better, it's more good than bad what we have on this graph. The zero line here, the thick horizontal white, indicates when countries are growing or shrinking in daily new cases. And we can see that of the hardest hit countries in daily cases per million, about half of them are shrinking, maybe a little less than half, and about half of them are growing, but the trend still is roughly downward, maybe horizontal. There aren't too many countries in this list that are rapidly growing are rapidly increasing in growth rate. Everyone above the white line is growing. All of these are growing, but their growth rate isn't growing. So there's a trend, like take this one, Peru here. Yes, it's growing, but it used to be 30%, and now it's down to 16% weekly growth. So slowly trending towards zero, and then here are all the ones that have already crossed zero. If we look at the countries as a whole, it's always hard to make any sense of this graph, but just squinting at it, you see there are a lot of, we tend to have some very small, weird countries, if I may say, very small countries in population. They're weird in that they have statistical anomalies because they have so few cases, and so we can kind of ignore the top of this graph. And for instance, here we saw Estonia, which shot up to 150, shot right back down again, and that's what usually happens with these statistical anomalies. But if we look at the bulk of the rope chart here, it's centered somewhere around zero. We have about half of the countries. It seems a little thicker below zero, a little thinner above, so we have more of a variation in growth rate above. But if I had to guess, about half of the countries in the world are shrinking, and about half of them are growing. And there's no real clear trend whether their rate is shrinking or not. But if we look at the world's cases as a single line, we really do see a good trend where the world as a whole used to be growing by 1.3% per day, is now shrinking by 0.4% per day. It is continuing to drop downward, this line, steadily downward. The world's turned the corner, the world is shrinking as a whole. But that may be more due to the large countries that have had a real problem getting better than the small countries, many of which are catching it late. Let's see what the United States is looking like right now. And so there's an example. So the United States, which certainly had a problem back in early July, has steadily gotten better until about mid-August, where it crossed zero. It's been shrinking, and it's still shrinking at about 10% a day, a week, 10% a week. Not a super fast shrinking rate, but that is good. The United States has fewer and fewer cases on average every day. On the other hand, we can see a horizontal line here. It's no longer heading downward. If it just stays there forever, we're fine. 10% shrinkage every week will get us out of this thing. As long as we're below 0, we're doing well enough. But the fact that it's no longer trending downward is a little worrisome. Maybe indicates that we're going to be trending upward again. Maybe. So far, no indication of that, except for the simple fact that it used to be going downward and it isn't anymore. No bending. So the United States doing okay, and that's a big part of why the world is doing okay, because the United States has, 25% of the cases in the world? And so when it does this, so does the world mostly. But let's throw in Brazil as well. Brazil, similarly, but not as good, is shrinking, just barely, 2% a week, shrinking, horizontal, just like the United States, but it too is not growing in new cases. So the United States, Brazil, two of the biggest epicenters of the world, have turned the corner, seem to be getting better, but they're doing it at a pretty slow rate. They're very gradually getting better. It reminds me of April or May, after the United States peaked, when there was this very slow recovery, and then it lost it again. So will the United States lose it again? We'll see. My guess is not, but with going back to school and with winter coming, there are things changing, and those things will change the shape of this graph. So maybe we're heading into another dark time for the United States. But at this point, things are looking okay. Moving on to the states of the United States. Looking at the severity by state, this is also kind of a mixed bag. We've got, it looks a lot like the countries really. We have some extremely bad states in this batch of the worst 20, but most of them are okay. They're severe, so not okay in that sense, but they're trending downward, so at least they're not accelerating in severity. And when we look to the growth numbers, I think we'll see they look even better when you look at them in growth numbers. On the other hand, we have, well, the Virgin Islands, and I think this may be another, and Guam. When I did my analysis for the Medium article, I predicted that Hawaii especially was going to be part of the last wave of states, the ones that haven't gotten it. I didn't really talk much about the territories, but we see now that at least 2 of the territories really are hard hit right now. And this is all adjusted based on population, so we really can compare, say, this number for Virgin Islands to this number for Hawaii, or maybe better yet, this number for Idaho, where we can see that Idaho is pretty bad. It's a hot spot at 260, but it's slightly recovering. But and Hawaii actually is also slightly recovering. It was looking pretty bad there for a bit, but severity of Hawaii is dropping. But Guam and the Virgin Islands are sharply trending upwards in severity. And we also see, I think, really just one more, Delaware and maybe Kansas, very slightly trending upwards in severity. The rest of them are downward or horizontal, holding steady in severity. This doesn't look great, but it could be a lot worse, and it has been a lot worse. You only have to look at the earlier part of this graph to see the severity levels for the worst states, for these states. These 20 states, in fact, are much better than they were. They were in the 6, 7, 8, 900s. Florida was at 900. Look at Florida now. Florida at severity 900 has dropped to severity 200. It's very close to not even being hot anymore. Let's look at Arizona. Actually, that's interesting. The interesting thing is that Arizona doesn't even show here. Arizona, one of the worst hit, has recovered so thoroughly that it is not even in my top 20 anymore. But there's the graph of Arizona compared to Florida. Both of them very hard hit. Both of them recovering very strongly. Both of them still problematic, but Arizona at 70 is really on the verge of not being problematic. Florida at 200 is still a hot spot, but just barely. Arizona still just heading downward in the most delicious way imaginable. And so Arizona is looking very good. If we look at all the states, do we get anything useful here? Probably not. We can just see broadly again that things were a lot worse and now things are a lot better. And there are very few states over 300. And there are only a handful of the 50 plus states and territories that are hot spots at this point. Is there a trend downward? Well, I certainly see that some of these ones, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, there's a little cluster of those heading downwards. Also, South Carolina, I think this is. So a number of the worst hit ones have headed downward, but the ones that are really worst are not going downward right now. Those 2 territories, but also these 5 or 6 states. Texas, Puerto Rico, horizontal. Idaho is horizontal, slightly down. Hawaii, again, is doing a little better. California, let's look at California. California, the numbers maybe still can't be trusted because of a data problem that I've talked about some. Testing cases, we kind of lost track of tests for a while there, and that may in fact have been, it was part of this decline, the apparent decline. It was a true decline in reported cases, but it does not, as I often occasionally try to emphasize, reported cases is not the same as actual underlying infections. And this is a great example of why that is. If something goes wrong with testing, we just won't get reports, even if we identify cases. But even more to the point, there are often cases, a lot of cases, we don't identify at all that don't make it into this line. But once the testing backlog in the computer system was fixed in California, we started to see a rise. And this was expected. I was calling this a couple weeks ago, but I really didn't know how bad it would be. I think I guessed at that point, I had some wild guess that it might be 30% of this decline was due to that. We had 300,000 cases that hadn't made it into the testing system, 300,000 tests, I think. And I guess that's kind of what we're seeing here. We've seen a rise of as much as 30%, maybe just the barest hint of a downward trend now, but mostly we've been seeing California rise for a while. It's back into hot spot territory. It's been rising since the 9th of August. And because there were spikes in cases when those backlogs made it into California's database, we definitely expected to see some strong spikes, a few spike days, which we did. This averages it all out, so you don't really see the spikes on this graph. But by now, I would expect that to have abated. And I would kind of expect this number to have been back down to where it was if California really was still declining. But it's not doing that. So is California actually declining in infections? Maybe. Not clear. We'll need another week or so. This is, I think, a 14-day moving average. So it really takes 2 weeks for these. It'll take 2 weeks for that spike to fall completely out of this leading tip of the graph. So we have another week or so before we can really start saying, a little less than a week, I guess, whether that, to what degree that spike was. My guess at this point is California is kind of horizontal right now, and this upward trend is a little bit too strong, stronger than it really is, and the downward trend was a little stronger than it really was. And maybe this line, the way it was at a slight downward slope, maybe this is the real line, in that sharper, where it went slightly sharper here, is due to the testing, and now it's recovered, and maybe we'll pick up this trend line. But my intuition is California is not looking as good as it was here. It's actually gotten a little worse, but it's really hard to say with the data as it is. Let's take a moment and see if we can look at percent positive, because that might give us something. Though California, again, the data's wrong. All right, well, again, the California data has been wrong, so this has to be taken with a grain of salt. But the governor did withhold testing positivity numbers for a little bit until they'd settled down. And at this point, it seems like we're getting our numbers back, and so there's some sense that the government believes these numbers are fairly accurate. So if we're going to believe that, California's testing percentage is at 6.5. 6.5% of tests come back positive. That's not a bad number. If you look at a real success story like New York is down to well under 1%. That's success in testing numbers. But then if you look at something like Florida, though recovering, is still testing 16% positive. I tend to think of 10% as barely adequate and 8% as pretty good. So California is pretty good in testing numbers. Let's look at Arizona as well, because Arizona is certainly a major player here. Yeah, Arizona also looking a lot better. I actually haven't looked at this graph for a while, so this is a surprise to me. Arizona was just awful, almost up to 30% of all tests coming back positive, and now here they are flirting with 10. And again, 10 is a pretty good number, an adequate number. So again we see Arizona really recovering on a very solid trajectory to recovery. Florida, not so much, but it's doing better. It's getting better. Let's look at Texas. Yeah, Texas. So Texas is doing miserably right now in its positive percent rates. I think I would take another look at Texas up above, but Texas was doing okay. There's some obvious problems with the data here. There's no way that it really did this jump and then back down to here again. So maybe the data is suspect, but if we take it at face value, Texas has, with a 27%, 26% positivity rate, has a real problem. It could just be that testing capacity is very low, and so they're having to hoard their tests and use them only for the sickest patients, which drives testing up because you only test the ones that you think have it anyway. But I'm guessing it's something a little worse than that. Let's also take a look at Louisiana. Louisiana's looking great. Also a little bit of a surprise to me because I have them in mind as someone who hasn't been doing that well. Louisiana looking great. Looking good at 5%. Great is 1%. New York is looking great. Okay. Let me head back again now, and let's take a look at. Let's zoom in on a few of the ones we just looked at. I'm going to go to daily cases per million. Actually, I'm going to look at it in the trajectories graph, which shows what's happened in each state since they hit 100, since they got warm. So there's California, which rose sharply, stayed horizontal for a while, got a little better, and then we don't quite trust this final number, so maybe it's a little lower than this. I wouldn't be surprised if California is really more around 200 DCPM, but we'll see. Let's look at Arizona, because it's such a poster child for recovery. And New York, the true poster child for recovery. This is what happens when you recover. You get, even if you have it really badly, if you do everything right, and maybe if you get some luck as well, you can recover. New York down to 32 daily cases per million. That's a good number. That's not a really, really good number. If you look at something like, we hear about Australia, for instance, and you look at some of the other countries of the world, they have 2 or 12 in daily cases per million. New York, still fairly high. My guess is this is because they haven't closed their borders. New York does not bar other states from entering, citizens, residents of other states from entering, and that's just going to keep this number a little higher until all the other states get over it. And then, like Arizona is. Here's Arizona, peaked really high, looking quite a lot better, still a warm spot. It is not time to relax, Arizona. You want to do something like this. You can think about relaxing when you get down to where New York is, in the under 50 range. But above 100, it's still a warm spot. Florida, following very, very nicely in that trajectory that I've talked a lot about how states get it. They get warm, and 30 days in, they peak, and then 30 days later, 30 to 40 days later, they hit 100 again, and you can see both of them are just headed right in that direction, and then they never come back. That's what New York did. That's what these two are on a trend to do. Louisiana, though, the great problem child of my thesis, had a very small peak, never got much above 100, and then seems to have had what looks like it's almost like it's its first wave. Its shape, its height, very similar to what we've seen other places. It's almost as though somehow, I don't understand the mechanism, this one never really happened. It never really took. They got over it really fast in 3 weeks instead of 60 days. And maybe in the immune system, the metaphorical immune system metaphor that I so often use, they didn't have a chance to build up immunity. They never really got over it. It's like they stopped taking their antibiotics right around here, figuratively speaking, and so they never got down to that teens range, or in New York's case, 30s range, where they actually could say we've more or less licked this thing and now we can stop and let the system handle whatever bumps we see. I actually do want to pop back briefly to the countries, just to say, to talk a little bit about Australia or New Zealand, because by golly, New Zealand makes news like there's something happening there. And I just want to remind everyone of what happened in New Zealand. So 100 daily cases per million is a warm spot. My nomenclature, but head back to the States trends, it's not like that never happens. We often see 100 daily cases per million. All of these are way above that. You look at all the states together, 100 daily cases per million is, I'd say, a fairly reasonable number to say something is really happening here. Below 100 daily cases per million, is that significant? You look at something like Minnesota, never really had it very bad. It never got much above 100. Did something significant happen in Minnesota? Did it happen again? I think that Minnesota has never really had a serious case situation here. Some might say that 50 would be a better number to say it's warm. But anyway, I use 100, and we see a lot of places. The hardest hit places all get it way above 100, sometimes even above 1,000. Now let's go back and look at New Zealand, which is making news for having a resurgence. And that's just laughable if you look at this. I mean, technically, mathematically, yes, they had a resurgence. They had 0 cases for 60 days, 0 homegrown cases, and now they have 7 or something. But look at their peak, it was at 12 daily cases per million. Way less than New York has now, where no one's saying New York is seeing a resurgence. New York has 35 at its peak. New York had 500. New Zealand got over it, and they have 1 daily case per million. So these stories that say New Zealand is seeing a second wave, no, New Zealand is not seeing a second wave. And if we watch what we'll find, and New Zealand is radically cracking down now, and this is, I guess, appropriate, because maybe the 7 is just the tip of a new iceberg, and so they crack down for 2 weeks and probably don't see any new cases, or if they do, those cases don't spread, and they will stomp this thing back to 0, I think, in a matter of weeks. And that is what happens once you've already experienced, even if it's a little wave. You don't have any cases, you see the rest of the world suffering terribly, or you yourself have suffered terribly in the past, like New York, and you have these systems in place to stomp it out when it comes back. But New Zealand at this point does not have a problem. And neither does Japan. I talk about these a lot. Here's Japan. You might look at this graph and say, oh, they had a wave and now they're having another wave. Well, no, their wave was 4. It's a ripple, tiny ripple, and now they're having a medium-sized ripple to 10. Talk to me when it gets to 50. No, none of these places that are making the news are actually news, not in the sense of having any real number of cases when compared to anybody who actually has a real number of cases. Like any state of the United States has got New Zealand and Japan beat soundly in daily cases per million. All right, where was I? Trajectories. So I am pleased to say that we continue to see this trend I was just talking about. Once a state hits 100, it peaks in 30 days, drops off in 30 to 40 days, gets under 100 and never comes back. Now we do have a few of these which had strained my thesis for a while there by busting back above 100, like for instance Delaware, but you can see none of them have done this again. None of them have done the big wave again. There certainly are still problems there. Some of them are warm spots, but the broad picture still stands. We've never seen since this something like this. Louisiana being the only exception, and I do, after having seen a lot of these now, I am tending to say, well, Louisiana's first wave really started here. I don't know what that was, but it acts just like this is its first wave starting here. And so Louisiana appears to be recovering from its, well, if not its first wave, it's something that looks just like every other state's first wave. And so will it then continue on doing this? I hope so. And then again, the extrapolation here, which is much more speculative, to say that the United States has turned the corner and is shrinking, that's not speculative. That's just facts that come straight from the numbers. The United States is shrinking in cases, and so are all these states. The speculation is that the United States will never come back to these levels that we saw at the peaks. That's my speculation, based first on this graph, which is saying even 140 days in, none of these states have come back. And none of them have had a wave in the, what is that? Well, let's just see, since my mental arithmetic is failing me. Yeah, in the 5 months since their first wave, since their only wave, none of these states have had a second wave, with the possible exception of Louisiana. And this one also has this sort of offsetting thing where it never really got there. But whatever, I can make up exceptions. I can make up reasons why the exceptions are exceptions. It doesn't change the fact, even if they're not, that the broad trend is that the vast majority of states peaked, got over it, and have not come back. And we can expect, since none of these, for instance, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, none of these have come back, Rhode Island, Washington, Pennsylvania, none of these have had a second wave, anything like their first wave. From this, we can guess that none of the other ones, like, for instance, Mississippi, which is still in its first wave, Arizona is still in its first wave, Alabama, none of these, I speculate, will have a second wave like what they had. And if none of them do, the United States won't either. So, at least not in the next 5 months. And the nice thing about the next 5 months is it gets us to a vaccine in all likelihood. And the latest news suggests the vaccine will be effective, and the latest news suggests that a majority of people will take it, and it'll probably be made free for everyone. And so there's this way that we probably wouldn't put too much money on this. We probably will be able to ride this tail here all the way to a vaccine without ever seeing another 300s, 400s, 500s DCPM wave. And then it will really die away once the vaccine is firmly in the population. Okay, so I say that a lot, but here we are a week later, and still the evidence is pointing that way. There are no second waves among U.S. states. Anything else worth mentioning here? Oh yeah, of course, the percentage of growth. Top 20 worst states in daily cases per million, almost all shrinking now. You can see that from the previous graph. All those lines headed downward. Almost all the states are shrinking. The ones that aren't shrinking, Virgin Islands, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, are these last wave. I think my guess is what happened is there's an analogy here where when the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, continental Europe got devastated, but Iceland, Greenland, Iceland, one of them didn't, completely missed it. And the reason they didn't is because they were geographically separated, and because one particular boat that was about to go take plague to them realized it had plague and didn't leave. And so they missed the whole first wave of plague. And so it is when you are an island. In theory, when you are an island, if there's not a lot of travel between you and the mainland, and Hawaii certainly did what it could to discourage travel between it and the mainland by making all the tourists stay in their hotels for 2 weeks instead of going to the beach, and arresting them if they didn't. When you are an island, you can, in theory, completely avoid getting whatever plague is running around. But in this case, they didn't avoid it forever. They just deferred it. And so the mainland caught it, but this fourth wave, all the territories, or some of the territories, including Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, are now getting their own wave. And so Hawaii, quite hard hit, but recovering. They got hit before the other territories. They're recovering. Now we see Virgin Islands is catching it, also very hard hit with a 70% growth rate, not yet recovering. Puerto Rico, hard to say. The growth rate's fairly small, but it's the third worst of the states and territories. And interestingly, Kansas. I don't have Kansas in my mind as what's happened with Kansas. I think they maybe kind of missed some of the early Let's just look at Kansas. What has Kansas actually done? Yeah, Kansas has gone all over the place. Let's look at Kansas in the trajectories graph. Are they in the trajectories graph? Yeah, okay. So Kansas just Kansas is a little weird. They've never been a hot spot. And there's a wiggliness to this line that makes me think that their reporting is weird. But they've risen and not yet recovered from their first wave. They're in their first wave, really. And in fact, there's a sense that their first wave is going to have a second hump to it. Anyway, Kansas is not a major contributor right now. Where was I? Nope, didn't want to do deaths. I was looking here, I think. This is California. Okay, so looking at the growth rate for the worst hit states anyway, the big picture here is most of them are shrinking. Most of the states are seeing their growth rate shrinking. And that's not what I meant to say, though. It's true. Their growth rate is negative. The number of cases is dropping in all these states every day. Fewer and fewer cases every week. In some cases, Arizona is seeing 37% fewer cases every week. That's a huge drop. Arizona, we just keep seeing good stuff there. Kentucky also, we're doing really well. But generally, the hardest hit states are shrinking now. And their growth rates are also dropping. You could kind of see there's a general rope here from about around this area, trending downward to below zero, where most of the hardest hit states were growing and are now shrinking. So this is pretty good news for the states as a whole. The worst ones are shrinking and even trending downward in their growth rate, with those few exceptions. So pretty good news on the states front there. You can also see it for all states. Those are just the worst 20. You look at for all states, it's pretty thin up here above zero. There are very few states and territories that are growing. Almost all the states are shrinking. And that's why we see the United States as a whole is shrinking. Did I show that? United States as a whole shrinking. Solidly shrinking. Still a warm spot. Barely made its way to a hot spot briefly. Now shrinking. Down to 150, and weeks from now it'll become a warm spot. Weeks more, it'll get down below that 50 mark where we start to say we really are in a good place. But we are not yet in a good place in the United States. So allow me to say again, as I often do, this is not the time to relax. The overall trend of this graph has generally been upwards. We're much higher than we used to be back here. We still have a serious problem. Keep doing all the things that have allowed us to peak and decline. We have months ahead of us before we're in a place to relax. Wait for the vaccine, then we can relax. I'm going to look briefly at deaths just to see. I haven't looked at this graph, so I'm just going to be winging it here. Actually, let me zoom out for a minute just to say deaths were a lot worse back in April. Now we can see the general trend certainly is that our death rate has dropped a lot. There was a short-term rise in it that was sort of from the second bump. I don't understand, I don't know the mechanism for why deaths were so much higher in the first wave than in our second bump. Probably we're getting better at treatment. Maybe the healthcare infrastructure has gotten better, but whatever the case is, it's good news. We used to see 30 deaths per million per day. Now we see 10 in our worst cases, like Arizona. And Arizona is dropping. It's getting better. Mississippi slightly dropping, second worst. Florida is kind of horizontal, but at least it's not rising. South Carolina dropping. So the worst ones are horizontal or improving in their death rates. We definitely had a rise there for a while, and we were scratching our heads a little bit. Why is the death rate rising when the cases are... actually, the question first was, why is the death rate falling when the cases are rising? And I just thought it was because there was a lag of a few weeks before cases become deaths. I do think that's why. But yeah, again here we just see the deaths rate. The deaths graph follows the cases graph. It's delayed a little bit. And so now that the cases are starting to fall off, a few weeks later we're starting to see the deaths fall off. So that's good. Testing. We already looked at this, didn't we? Yeah, we did look at this. All right, I'll stop there on the States. The news on the States is still pretty good. The United States is dropping, still in a pretty hot place. I'm not leaving my house when I can avoid it, and I recommend all the things still. I think it's what's gotten us here, and it's what will get us the rest of the way out of this. We're only maybe a quarter to a third out of the worst of it right now, but there is an end in sight, and I do believe that we're heading in a good direction. I think that's very clear. And if I may speculate, we may not ever get as bad as where we were before if we keep doing what we're doing for a few months, just a few months. If there's one message that I was trying to make with my Medium article, is we're just a few months from the place where we can relax. You might not know it if you just look at the news reports right now. The news reports would suggest that things are terrible. And they're only terrible in total cases. They're not terrible in the direction we're going. We've done well. Stay the course. We can get out of here, and it's just months from now, I think, when we will. Moving on to the counties of California. I'm not going to spend too much time here because the data is still whacked. Those numbers, the computer system really did, I think, artificially drop the numbers in California for a while, and now that they've undone it, it's artificially raising the numbers in California. So if you looked quickly at the severity chart, you'd think everything was going to hell. I don't think it is. It might be rising in reality, but my guess is it's flat or down. But we'll see. And we certainly did expect a rise, or a rising component of these graphs due to that computer system coming back online. And about a week ago, we got some very high numbers of cases. But let me just see. Does this? Yeah, this will show me Googling it, right? Yeah. California COVID-19 cases. I sometimes pop over to Google to get a sense of what's really going on. Because I do all this moving average stuff, but Google does the individual days. So just to give a sense, things seemed like they were heading downward. These are the individual day counts for California. Things seemed to be heading downward, and then we found out that the data were wrong because of this computer problem. And then they spent a few days thinking about the computer problem. They fixed it, and right about here, they started reporting these numbers again. 12,000 a day, just like at the worst, 12,000 a day. 12,000 a day, then it looked like maybe they'd stopped reporting it. Then we had this one more day that was 12,000. And since then, we've had just 3 days that have been dropping. So what does this all mean? I don't know, but if I had to guess, I would say that these peaks here were catching up on computer stuff. This one maybe not. So it's possible we had a legitimate 12,000 day, not because of a computer problem, but because of actual infections and testing. But on the other hand, here are 3 days that look a lot better. So we don't have enough time, and we haven't had enough time post-computer error to really say what's going on here. But there are pointers in both directions. That day is weird. Maybe they had another batch that went into the computer, but I thought they'd already caught up at this point. But then these days look good, very good actually. A descending line, and so maybe overall, if I had to guess, I'd say California is actually descending in daily cases. But you wouldn't know it from this graph because this has those spikes contributing to the growth rate, and it makes it look a lot worse than it probably really is. And similarly, the growth rates of counties, we can see some of them are still shrinking, but there is this very sharp increase. When I looked at this just a couple days ago, several of these counties were heading off to infinity, like Marin here. Those, I think Sacramento might have been one of those. Those have since started to flatten out, or at least look like normal sharp growth and not this shoot to infinity thing. And so I have a feeling Marin's going to start to look more like Sacramento, and that we're actually going to see all of these peak and head downward, but I don't know where they really land. Are the counties of California actually growing again? They weren't. Back here, it seemed they weren't. Or I guess that's when we had our data problem, so maybe they were then too. We don't know. It's hard to say. Give me another 2 weeks, and we definitely will have flushed that data problem from the system here, and we'll be able to really give numbers on California. But right now, all I can say is the graphs went down a lot, then they went up a lot, and probably both of those are bogus. I wonder if we've got any data that isn't based on that we can write. Do we have deaths? We don't have deaths here. We'll look at the testing. I think the testing numbers are real, but we don't have, all we have is the population tested. Yeah, I can't do much here. I don't have the kind of stuff we have in the States, but I will say that California as a whole, the positive testing number, again, the governor has started releasing these numbers again because they think it's fairly good. They think it's fairly solid, like real accurate data now, and the testing numbers for California are looking okay. California in the lower middle of the pack, I'd say, in terms of positive testing percentage. So California has always been marching to its own drum in these graphs, and it continues to do so, not really following the trends we see elsewhere. So if I had to guess, California's kind of so-so in its metrics right now, but we'll keep watching. In a week or two, we'll know a little better where California is actually headed. So that's the news. The countries are looking okay, pretty good. The world as a whole is dropping and is continuing to drop in cases. That's good. The states are looking very good, really, in their trends. They still have a huge number of cases, but those cases are dropping on a daily basis. If we keep doing what we're doing, we'll keep seeing that happen. And the United States will start to fall out of the lead as an epicenter, probably to be replaced by Central South America and a few other wild, small countries that are just outliers because of their size. So the news is better than it's sometimes been, but at least in California, we don't know what's happening, and we won't for a few weeks. So there's a big question mark there. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.